ahead. My name is Maribeth Leonard. I'm the CEO at LifeWays Community Mental Health. And I was asked to speak today, do a brief little training on the art of difficult conversations. So we'll go ahead and get started. So what is a difficult conversation? Probably when you think about it, think of a situation that you might be experiencing now, or situations you've been in the past, and where it is anything that, right away when you start thinking about, oh, I've got to have this conversation with, whether it's a family member or somebody at work, you really get uncomfortable. It gets you uncomfortable even thinking about it. It's also difficult conversations are when opinions vary on a specific issue. And also when emotions tend to be very high, and usually on both ends relative to the conversation. But having the ability to successfully engage in difficult conversation is really an important skill to successfully manage relationships, not just at home and at work, but out at, at play and with anybody that you might come into contact with. So what are some examples of difficult conversations? Well, I put some up here, and you can probably think of some that you might have experienced or are experiencing. But like on a professional level, it could be that maybe you have to address an offensive behavior from a coworker. Maybe you need to talk to your boss about a difficult conversation with feedback about something that might be occurring. And then what about in your home life? They can be things like in your personal life, maybe you have to end or want to end a relationship. Maybe it's custody issues with your children. It could be dealing with a rebellious teen. How many of us can relate to this picture that I have in front of you when we think about having a difficult conversation? Often we find ourselves wanting to put our head in the sand and believing, okay, well, maybe the situation will resolve itself. But why do you think that might be, that many of us find ourselves like that from time to time with difficult conversations? A lot of it has to do with what I just talked about a minute ago, relative to how uncomfortable it makes us feel, as to why that is. But then how would you know? How would you know when it is time to have that difficult conversation? I think you have to ask yourself a couple of key questions. What's at stake here? What's at stake if I have the conversation or if I don't have the conversation? What happens if you don't? What could happen if you do have the conversation? And then it's always important when you're thinking about the issue at hand, is it actually something that's within your control as to whether or not you should be having this conversation? But often difficult conversations do not go well. And why is that? Think back to maybe a situation that you were in, whether it was with a family member or whether it was with potentially a work situation that did not go well. If you can reflect back on that situation, you might find that one of these things was critical in that conversation. Maybe emotions took over, could be on your end, it could be on the other person's end, or it could have been both of you. You also have a physical reaction, and we'll talk a little bit more about why that is, but you could have had that made the situation not go well. Maybe you're having this conversation, but you're really not prepared for it, and somebody else might be pressuring you that they want you to address this problem. And so you're approaching the situation and having this difficult conversation, but you're really not prepared to do that, but feeling pressured that you need to. And then often we're at a loss. We really don't even know how to approach the conversation and even get it going. And then another one, and this is a normal response, is that we tend to act defensively when we have a difficult conversation. Um, what are some things really to avoid so that the conversation does go well? It really is really looking at your assumptions before you even enter into the conversation. Uh, Assumptions regarding what the other person's intentions are often wrong. Even though we may be feeling intimidated or ignored or disrespected from that other person, making the assumption that that was actually their intention is more than likely the wrong assumption. And it is interesting that we as human beings tend to go to believing bad intentions about individuals versus assuming good intentions. And when you start a conversation believing that the other person has bad intentions, it automatically puts up a defensiveness from that person when you're trying to have that conversation. So you got to approach the difficult conversation from the mindset of really knowing where you're coming from before you even have the conversation. What's your attitude about the topic that you want to talk about? Could it at all have an influence on on your own perception of the problem? That old saying, if you believe it will happen kind of thing, is if you think that it's going to go horribly wrong or it's going to be horribly difficult, it probably likely will be. If, on the other hand, if you really try to approach the situation believing good, that no matter how this conversation goes, I know it's going to be difficult on both ends, but ultimately there's going to be some good that comes out of this, that will likely be what you see, because that is the mindset that you're taking into the conversation. And where do we probably the biggest one is you need to make sure you're well prepared. Preparation is the key. And kind of like I just talked about, making sure that you have the right attitude going into the conversation, because it really is difficult to have a productive conversation if you're going into it with looking at it from the perspective of going to blame that person or going to try to determine who was right in this situation. When you start going down that road, you also tend to have your emotions then that take over the conversation, and that can happen on both sides. Another thing that I always try, I work a lot with, obviously, a leadership team, and, if you work, people don't always get along. It's just like at home, you don't always get along, but we always want to try to focus on the facts of the situation and try to remove the people out of it, and not having those assumptions about why somebody might have took the action that they did or responded in a certain way. And always try to have a goal of the conversation is to try to come to a mutual answer or solution, a path moving forward. And one way that you can make that happen is when you're having this meeting, this difficult conversation, you really need to create an environment with that person that really is about inquiry. It's really about learning from their perspective. So you see this picture where I show, and this often happens, I'm saying this and you're saying that, and we're not hearing the same thing. But it is important for us to hear that other voice and to see how that other person might be seeing that issue differently. I tell staff all the time, especially staff that supervise other staff and have to have difficult conversation, you can have a very difficult conversation and still do it in such a way that is sensitive to that other person, that shows and communicates a level of empathy, but still be very clear about your expectations. And when you're creating this environment of inquiry with the other person, it really is important, and it's a hard thing to do. is to really listen. Really listen to gain understanding of the issue, to look for that path forward. Because often when you take the time to listen to the other person, you can often hear where that potential solution is for a common ground moving forward. Um, but it does, when you create this environment of inquiry with the other person, it allows them to feel safe. It allows them to feel as though they have some ownership of the issue as well. And they're more likely to be looking at it from a problem-focused solution as well. And then another key one is to have a plan. I always, when I know I'm going to have a difficult conversation, I do write out kind of the issue at hand, and the pros and cons, and kind of answer some of those questions I showed earlier about what's at stake, what is it that what's the goal, what is it I'm intending to accomplish here, and kind of work through that in my own mind. And if you're lucky enough that you have somebody that you could role play that with, that's a good plan as well. But there are some tips and some suggestions from those that do this kind of work all the time around tips and suggestions for having that difficult conversation go well. One of them is really to look at, that having a successful outcome with a very difficult conversation is really contingent on two things. It's about how you are, and how you are means when you get ready to approach that difficult situation, do you approach it from a supportive perspective? Are you curious and listening to that other individual? Are you focused on problem solving? Because if that's your approach, you're going to be responding back to that person in messages and communication that also ring that same supportive, problem solving, listening message. Otherwise, if you approach it from assuming, making assumptions about their intentions or becoming defensive, that's going to greatly influence how you respond back to that person. It is also important as a tip to acknowledge emotional energy. I understand, I hear what you're saying, and acknowledge both your emotion on the topic as well as theirs. And don't take any verbal attacks personally. Try to help if there are verbal attacks coming at you, like, well, you didn't do this and that's your fault because you didn't. Try to recenter them as to why you came together to have this conversation. And don't assume, and this actually goes in both directions, is that don't assume that they can see things from your point of view and that you can see things from their point of view. Because when you actually take the time to listen, you often hear a point of view that you did not think about or were aware of. How do you begin? It's like, okay, now I know I've walked through all those steps. I know it's time for me to have this difficult conversation. I've kind of role played, but I'm really struggling with how do you actually start the conversation? But there are some suggestions about different ways that you can actually start the conversation. You can say, I need your help with something. Can we talk about it? And if they say, sure, follow up with them. Don't leave it hanging out there. Talk to them about, I think we have different perceptions about your attendance at work. I'd like to hear your thinking on this. Or I'd like to talk to you about your missing curfew every night. I think we may have different opinions on how to address this issue. And then again, like I was saying earlier, it's really important that we stop talking and start listening. When you turn the conversation over, when you start that conversation, you say, okay, I want to talk to you about this. I want to hear your side. You turn it over to them and know and be comfortable in the silence, because there will be silence as the other person tries to, have time relative to a response. be prepared that that is going to be part of the most difficult part of the conversation, is when you let them know that this is what we're going to be, I need to talk with you about. And then understand that defensiveness is inevitable. There probably will be a response back that they're trying to defend their point. And probably a hard one, I don't know if many of you experience this, but it is for me, is really trying not to interrupt. It's very hard to do. But to sit there and listen. I often, my husband would probably express, this is probably one of his frustrations with me, is I often think I know where he's going with this conversation, and I will automatically interject myself into where I think he's going. And I think that's, that is something it's very hard not to do, but do not interrupt and allow them to be able to finish that is important. And then really knowing both sides of the issue and understanding the contribution, both what are they contributing to the situation that you're having this difficult conversation about, helping them understand what their contribution to that problem is, and also what is it potentially that you might be contributing. Is it a situation in where you're contributing because maybe I wasn't clear with my employee about what my expectations really were. I made some assumptions about the fact that I thought they understood when I said this, it meant that. But really identifying that and then clarifying, what you would have them do differently, and take any responsibility for your own contribution early in the conversation. I'm sorry, we're having to have this difficult conversation, but I do want you to be aware of the fact that I understand that sometimes when I think I've sent when I think I've told you what it is that I need, sometimes maybe I'm not as clear as I think I am. And maybe moving forward, I agree to do this differently, and then have them clarify what they would have themselves do differently. And then respond and not defend. This is, again, another tough one for us to do, is to really take the time to pause and think before we respond. Resist the temptation to respond in kind. So if somebody is attacking you and blaming you, resist the urge to respond back in that very same way. Be calm and again, try not to be defensive. And then when you're wrapping up the conversation, really kind of restate, we came together today to talk about your work attendance, clarify the misinformation. If there was misinformation that was understood, well, making sure that that's explained out. Reiterate your expectations and if there are any boundary issues. And then clarify what you both agreed to. During the course of this conversation, you and I have agreed that I will do this to be supportive to you, and that you've agreed to do this. And then most importantly, the 3 C's: be calm, be concise, and be confident with your discussion on a very difficult issue. I did include on this last page some resources of some authors with some great books. Many of you might have already read some of these relative to how to have difficult conversations, both in your personal life and in your work life. So I would recommend, if you're wanting to continue to develop your leadership, these would be great resources for you. And with that, I think they said I have 15-20 minutes. I think I am right on time with that. I don't know if there were, Tim, if there was opportunities for questions, or if that's it.
Thanks very, Maribeth. That was very informative. And yes, if you have the time and there are questions from those tuning in, please fire away.
Well, I'm not hearing any, so I don't know if that means that I was so thorough. I'm not hearing any questions. So, well, I appreciate the opportunity and thank you for inviting me to this women's leadership event. I appreciate that.